That's one of my bikes. That's called a Husqvarna Svartpillen, which means a black arrow. And I took it in front of Albert Einstein, because you know, who's the guy who said E equals mc squared, which means everything equals motorcycles multiplied by motorcycles. So, and that just proves it. You know, and the fact that motorcycles exist is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy. So we're going to swap this out for the other one. Okay, there you go. I better get my notes out. I can talk about motorbikes off the top of my head, but if you want me to concentrate, then I need a bit of a prompt. When Matt asked me to speak, he said your study group has been studying the book of James. That's good. So he said, speak about that if you like, or something about it, something else. And I said, no, I'm happy to fit in with that. So what I thought I'd do is talk a little about the book of James. I've got this up here. James is a very short book. It's only 5 chapters long. You can read it in a single sitting if you've got a bit of concentration. So this is divided into the 14-step plan for the Christian life. And if you've done the study stuff over a bit of time, then you might recognise a few of these. I'm going to leave that up there as I speak. There's no more slides. But many of you know that before I retired a few years ago, I was a prison chaplain for 20 years. And I was 10 years as prison chaplain out at Bathurst Jail. And when I was out there, I came across a couple of guys that I'll call Bill and Ben. Now, Bill and Ben... That's it. Bill and Ben, the flower pot men. And they're kind of cute and sweet and innocent. But I haven't got a clue. I haven't got a clue what kids' TV show they're out of. But Bill and Ben, the flower pot men. And there was little... It was what? Oh, his own show. Yes. All right. And there was the little weed. And so anyway, you all know it. Well, whatever. The young at heart know who I'm talking about. But whatever you think of Bill and Ben, they're kind of sweet and cute and innocent. And the 2 men I'm going to speak about now are exactly the opposite. And we're going to get to this slide before too long. And so here's the story of Bill. Bill was an armed bank robber. And he would walk into a bank with a sawn-off shotgun and demand money and terrorise the staff. And he did that several times and got caught and ended up doing long prison service. The first time I met him, when he came to Bathurst, Bathurst was a medium security jail. He'd been in maximum for a while. As his sentence came down a few years, he got sent out to Bathurst. I can still remember my first conversation in the workshop where he was working. I wandered through and just get into conversation to see how people are going. And he started to tell me the story about seeing aliens. He saw this spaceship land and the aliens got out, and he'd look up behind the bush and they'd look up and they'd duck down. And it was obvious that he was a bit chemically enhanced, even in jail. And then he said to me, do you believe in aliens? And I said, mate, I believe in extraterrestrials, and the chief extraterrestrial is a friend of mine. And he figured out I was talking about Jesus, you see. And so we kind of became friends because we're a bit mad as each other in that conversation. And he got involved with chapel stuff and he came to faith, and the conviction that God laid on his heart was very real, and the change was very real. And officers, after about 2 years, officers would say to me, whatever's happened to Bill looks very real. We've seen a lot of guys get religion and that's gone in weeks or a couple of months, but this guy is still there after 2 years and he's a very different person. So here's a couple of stories about Bill in the wing. He was a big, heavy bloke. And he'd go into the gym and he'd walk out an hour and a half later and he's put on about 3 kilos of muscle. You know, he's that sort of really muscly kind of bloke. And so he kind of ran the wing that he was in, kept it calm and quiet, and there was a big fella standing over a new younger bloke who just arrived at the jail for his, can of Coke or something. And anyway, Bill came up and said, give it back to him, mate. And he said, oh, here comes the bishop. He used to get, that was his nickname. Here comes the bishop. What are you going to do? Pray for me. And Bill said to this guy, mate, you give him back the can of Coke, or I'm going to show you what my life was like before I become a Christian. So the young guy got his can of Coke back and everyone went back to normal. And a couple of years later, we had another guy in that wing, Dave. Dave had very bad seasonal depression. Well, not seasonal in winter time, but he'd be up and down and he'd be going into deep depression. Let's just wait for this. Oh, we won't wait too long. He would go into deep depression and not even get out of bed. Now, people in jail get mustered every couple of hours, so they've got to do the mark the roll and make sure no one sort of run off and disappeared. And so they would muster him in his cell. The officers knew that it's not going, it might last a day. We've got to get him to the medics. They'll adjust his medication and then he'll settle out again. Well, this particular time, Dave refused to come out of his cell like he was velcroed to the bed for 3 days. They said, that's it, we've got to get him out and get him to see the psychiatrist and get his medication stabilised. And so they do what's called a cell extraction, which means they get 4 or 5 officers in riot gear, and by the time they've got a reluctant guy out of the cell, it's not pretty. And so they assembled, and the area manager, who was sort of in charge of that whole wing, he said, hang on a minute, go and get Bill. So Bill came up and he said, we've got Dave in here. If we can't get him out, we're going to have to do a cell extraction. Can you go and have a talk with him? I'll give you about 3 to 5 minutes. Otherwise, we're going to have to send in the squad. Well, inside of about 2 minutes, Bill came out with Dave. Now, the fact that the area manager of the jail was prepared to trust an inmate who was such a violent past in that sort of thing was just testament of how deep the faith was running in Bill. So that's a bit about Bill. Now, here's the story about Ben. Ben was totally crazy violent. And his weapon of choice was about 2 or 3 feet of 4x2. And you didn't want to get in the way when he was going to rob you or attack you in the street or hijack your car or anything. He was lots of violence in his past. The police were chasing him. One time he got into a police chase and he drove off into the hills and he's up this dirt road, somewhere up in the hills and some mountain somewhere, on the east coast somewhere. And the police car still following him up this dirt road. So he turned around and he drove straight into the police car. The car he'd stolen was pretty old. The police pursuit car wasn't. It had airbags. So as soon as he rammed the front of the police car, the airbags went off. The police car was immobilised. He turned around and drove away and made a getaway. So he got caught, obviously. And one of his charges, in amongst all the violent stuff, was using a motor car as a weapon. So I didn't know you could get charged with that, but there you go. So that was Ben. Now Ben got involved, let me just see. He came to faith in jail and he got involved with chapel stuff. Ben was a compulsive gambler and we could never really calm that out of his life. A lot of guys in jail play poker and they use cans of Coke and that sort of stuff. It's weekly buy-ups, it's called. It's like the school tuck shop. And so he owed some young bloke a couple of cans of Coke from the poker games from last week. So he came back from his buy-up and he had a few cans of Coke and a packet of biscuits or something. The young bloke says, hey, Ben, you owe me 2 cans of Coke. And Ben was another big sort of hefty bloke. And he said, I'll give you what I owe you, mate. Bang! And he hit him across the side of the head and splayed him over the floor, then just walked away. So no one messed with Ben in the jail. When Ben got out of jail, I found him on the streets of Newcastle. Because I'd had 10 years in Bathurst and I came to Newcastle, worked for 10 years up here, working with guys coming in and out of jail and rehab, mostly jail. But I saw Ben and so I took him to Soul Cafe to show him where he could get a free lunch. Most of you know Soul Cafe down the street. And his behaviour was so bad we both got kicked out. So it's the first time I've ever been kicked out of Soul Cafe. Anyway, I continued working with him. He made contact with his ex and his son down in Sydney, decided he was going to move down there to be close. I had a friend down in Sydney named John Noble, and he was running a community chaplaincy program. So I put him in touch with John, and John found him a flat. John now runs the Wayside Chapel in King's Cross. So he's used to working with guys who are down and out and on the street. So this was many years ago now. And so then he organised some people to get around Ben and to help him through getting established in the flat. So that's the story of Bill and Ben. I'm now going to tell you a story about the two of them together. And I'm still remembering, we've got this slide up here. One time in chapel, we were in prayer time. And there would have been 8 or 10 of us in the chapel. And we're just praying about stuff. And Ben, who was the crazy guy, he prayed, Lord, thank you that your grace and forgiveness covers me for all my sins day by day. Now, Bill, who was the guy whose life had really changed, he was a fella who was very obedience-minded. He knew that his life had been wrong and bad and he had to fix stuff, and he was following the word of God. So he said, Lord, thank you that you give us a way to live our life in obedience to you. And so he prayed an obedience kind of prayer. And so then Ben came back and said, Lord, thank you that when you saw that woman in adultery, you were gracious enough to get those guys away from her who were going to stone her. And then Bill came back and he said, Lord, thank you that when you saw that woman in adultery, you said to her, go and sin no more, and set her on a new path of obedience. So we had the obedience team and the grace and forgiveness team having a prayer war. I've never seen a prayer war. And everybody else, they wouldn't have recognised what was going on, but I knew these guys, maybe they did. I mean, sometimes when you're in a group, the only thing you really want is for someone else to pray so that, you don't get put on the spot. But anyway, I said, okay, you guys, that's it, call it quits. And I called everything to an end. I said, listen, there's a passage in the Old Testament that says, how blessed on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news. So how many feet does that messenger have? 2 feet. So the good news is being brought to the world and to the mountains with 2 feet. One of those feet is called obedience, and one of those feet is about grace and forgiveness. So you two are a matched pair, but you don't appreciate that. But if you two could actually get together, you could set this jail on fire for Jesus. They couldn't quite manage it because their personalities, they just had too much history. I mean, they're both great guys in their own way. I've kept in contact with both of them for quite a while after their release. And what happened was that Bill, the bank robber, he started working. He did a stop-go training. He started working with his local council. And then he got his truck license and became a driver for the council, and he became a foreman for his road group. And then he started a Bible study. Tuesday lunchtimes, they do a Bible study with his road group if they want to join in. See? All sorts of crazy stuff that you see can happen in the future of these fellas. Then he went back to the banks that he'd robbed, and he rang the managers and said, I'd like to come and apologise. And I said, how did that go? And he said, I was terrified. But they treated me with grace and respect. And he said, I just couldn't believe that. So anyway, that's what God does when he's deep in someone's life. Now, I've not kept in touch with Ben once he moved down to Sydney. He's in somebody else's care. But that's the story of Bill and Ben. Let's get back to the book of James. The early Christian community grew out of the Jewish community, and it existed within that community for quite a long time. Now, the early Christians didn't have any scriptures of their own. They had the Jewish scriptures, which we call the Old Testament. And the Old Testament had the encoding of the law that was sort of the code that everybody lived by. So when the Christian church started up, they sort of followed in that Jewish tradition. But then people from outside Judaism started to get converted. So people then had to decide what's going to happen with these people. And there were people who said they need to become Jews first before we can let them be Christians. And other people said, no, that can't be right. That's not what Jesus was on about. So let me just find we need a taller pulpit for my poor old eyes. Okay, perhaps the most famous, I spoke about this lady just a little minute ago, perhaps the most famous thing we see of conflict between the Christian church and the Jewish community was the beginnings when Jesus really got into conflict with the religious leaders about their laws. I spoke about that woman who was found in adultery with some other guy, and they dragged her into the town, and the leaders said, "Get this Jesus guy here," and they said, "The law of Moses says she should be stoned, but what do you say?" And he knelt down on the ground and he just wiggled his finger in the dirt a bit, maybe just biding time, letting them stew a little. And then he stood up and he said, "Whoever was without sin, throw the first stone." And so they realised that, well, he's not going to follow the law, but we can't fight against what he said, you see. And so the wisdom of grace overstepped or just covered over the letter of the law, and they walked away. And that's when he said, "Go and sin no more." Similar conflicts happen within the Christian community, and so the major conflict that erupted was whether a guy who wasn't a Jew and become a Christian, whether he had to be circumcised according to the law of Judaism, which they circumcised their boys when they were born, and so that was a major conflict. And Paul spoke about it and against it. And if you read through the book of Galatians, then you'll see that argument playing out. And he complains about Peter. Peter's a very strong guy of faith, but Peter was won over by the rules and regulation team. And Paul was the grace and forgiveness team. And so that was argued about. And you can see that in Galatians. But see, what happened was that here's this community, this religious community, that had the Jewish scriptures, which is mostly about, well, their history and their prophets, but also about law and rules and regulations. The Christians then had to decide, how are we going to relate to that because of these conflicts? So along comes a guy named James. See, we're getting there. Along comes a guy named James. There's a few Jameses mentioned in the New Testament. One was the younger brother of Jesus, and we're told that he wasn't a believer until after Jesus' resurrection, when he came to faith, and he ended up being the leader of the church in Jerusalem. There's another James, who was James and John, and Jesus called them Boanerges, was their Greek name, back in the language of those days, but it means sons of thunder. So these two brothers, that probably meant that they rode Harleys with straight-through pipes. But I suspect because they had short tempers and they were all set to get into a fight fairly easily, which sounds a bit like somebody who might ride a Harley with straight-through pipes. But that was one of the Jameses, and there's another one who just gets a mention that he's gone. So there's a few Jameses, and the scholars sort of have a bit of discussion about which guy wrote the book of James. So we're not going to worry too much about that. But this is what James did. He saw the conflict. And so he just started to put in a bit of wisdom on how you go about living the Christian life. So this was sort of a self-help guide. So you might get those books about follow your dream or give it to the universe and it'll come back to you, or all that sort of book stuff, you know, the self-help books you get. Well, James wrote this book on how to live the Christian life. And as you read through it, you'll see reflections of the conflict between the rules team and the faith team. And it appears through here. What you can see up here is the progression of his work. So we've divided into 14 bits. Now I put the numbers up, but I didn't invent that. Just in case you kind of like the idea of what the format is in here, there's an easy way you can have nearly instant access to it, and that is, it's on Wikipedia. So how easy is that? You see how nice I am to everybody? I don't expect you to take notes. You can just go to the Wikipedia page on the letter of James, and you'll see this, so that you can refresh your memory on how these things get sorted into different areas. And this is the way he wrote it. And it was deliberately written in a way, so he said, here's a few thoughts about this, and here's a few thoughts about this, here's a few thoughts about this. It's not a gospel, it's not one of the stories of Jesus. It's not a letter to a church he started, like Paul wrote to the church in Rome and in Corinth, and he said, when I was there with you, I said this, and say hello to Chloe and her grandma, a person of great faith, and tell her grandson to mow the lawn. And so he'd send these letters to the churches. That's Paul's thing. But James wrote just letters, he just wrote this little manual, this handbook of living the Christian life, to try and help people navigate between the conflict of the rules team and the grace team. And he said, you've got to keep both going, guys. You just have to keep both of them going and do it with a bit of common sense. So here's a few things out of it. In chapter 1, we've got things like, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Well, we don't like being tested. But, whatever doesn't kill us makes us stronger. That's the saying. This is what James was saying a couple of thousand years ago, something similar, produces perseverance. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry. So you can see in there must have been a few people who were slow to listen and quick to speak and getting angry a bit too soon with each other in that kind of conflict. Religion that God our Father accepts is pure and faultless as this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Very famous thing. Doesn't matter how much you're going to go to church and look all holy, if you can't care for people in need, well, what use are you to planet Earth? Chapter 2, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have food but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. So he's going straight into that rules versus faith conflict. Put your money where your mouth is. If you're going to talk the talk, you've got to walk the walk. All kinds of animals, birds, reptiles and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It's a restless evil full of deadly poison, so watch what you speak, what you say. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. See, we live in a world now where how easy, you look at social media and people find it so easy to be critical. They can be the keyboard warriors who are anonymous and send death threats to people they don't agree with just because they think they're not going to be found out. So this is talking directly to that point of view. Chapter 4, submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Come near to God and he will come near to you. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbour? If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is a sin for them. So back into the conflict of put your faith into action. You know what you're supposed to do. You don't need a rule book, but you need to live by some kind of inner code. Chapter 5. Is anyone among you in trouble? Let them pray. Is anyone happy? Let them sing songs of praise. Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. They're just some of the famous verses out of the book of James. I could have told you chapter and verse and you would have been able to put them into all of those slots, but maybe you did that as I was reading. The book of James is fairly short. And if you can remember what I said, you can read it just in one sitting. As I said, you only have to get 10 or 15 minutes of quiet moment and just read through the thing, nice and slowly. Do it with two things in mind. One is, keep in mind the conflict between the rule people and the faith people that I've spoken about, because you'll see that reflected all the way through the book. It speaks of having faith, but of showing faith by how you live. There's always a conflict between rules and faith, and the way through the Christian life is to somehow balance those two views, and that's what this letter of James is trying to do for people. Don't take one side or the other. Don't take the extremes. Don't think just because you're on a bit of a high ground that you've got some claim over the views of others. The second thing to keep in mind is the story I told you of Bill and Ben. You know, they were just the classics of the difference between the rule team and the faith team, but how they might have made significant changes to the environment they lived in if they could get together and recognise the value of each other. But they just took sides too easily, and each one, especially that prayer time, they were sort of like little in a fortress. They'd made, like kids with Lego, they'd made a fortress and they were going to defend it. And but that war, they had something value to offer to each other. If we go through the book of James, we can see those things. We can see the conflict, but we can also see James's resolution of trying to get people from different sides to say, let's work together on this instead of working separately. And here's the last thing. There are times when we need to stop and not look so much at the world around about us, or not look at these examples I've given, but look within our own lives. Because Bill and Ben live within us. We've all got a bit that wants to follow the rules, and we've all got a bit that wants to relax and say, God, you're going to have to take care of this. You know, I'm going to need your grace or your forgiveness more than my own attempt to make a recovery here. And so that struggle is within us to varying degrees in everybody and pretty much all the time, not all the time. Sometimes we might be sort of rules today and faith tomorrow. And but just recognise that we lean both directions. That's what being human is. That's the beginning of the conflict and the continuation of the conflict. But within ourselves, well, then we just need to find that way. If you come across a rules person, don't write them off. Just recognise that's someone that I can work with. If you come across a grace person and you're a bit of a rules person at that particular day, don't write them off. Just that's someone that I could work with. We need to learn from each other. We need to allow God to be gracious to us and to them. So there you go. That's the end. That's all I've got to say. The book of James. I hope that what you've studied so far, this puts a bit of perspective around it, and it sort of matches in. So that as you study the finer points of those things, well, then you kind of say, hey, yeah, I can see how that's relevant then, relevant now, and what I've got to do, you know, how it sort of applies to me. So my best wishes, brothers and sisters, to the Bill part of you, and the Ben part of you, and the James part of you that really wants to get life going in a smooth way that honours God and just honours the history of the fellow who wrote this book.
Hey, what a fantastic morning with Kim Miller at Biker Church. Hope you got a lot out of his message. Wow, so powerful, thinking about that conflict, that constant conflict between the rules guys and the grace guys. And I'm sure that the reality is we all struggle with that to some degree. And great encouragement from Kim. So blessings, Kim. Thanks so much for that. Hey, make sure you subscribe to the channel. You'll get monthly Biker Church like this. But also you'll see us on the runs and having lots of fun, and it'll give you a bit more of an idea about what Longriders is about. So please hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell, and that'll let you know when new clips are available. And have a fantastic week wherever you find yourself. Bless you.